Now, before I can actually make any kind of podcast episode for you guys, I want to explain one thing. Have you guys heard about Anchor? It's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain how. One, it's free. Two, there's just many tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or your computer. And it'll distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other things like iTunes and such. You can make more money from your podcast regardless on how much you have already. So it's like extra money. Hello, who doesn't like free money? And then, it's everything you need to make a podcast all in one spot. So whenever you can, just download the free Anchor app at, your iTunes store, your Apple store, or your Google Play store, or go to anchor.fm to get started. Thanks, y'all. Good morning. What was I about to say? This is going to be Storytime with Izzii, and I got a book while I was being held up and everything this past week and a half or however long it was, called Anne of Green Gables. I'm not sure who or if you remember that from school. I remember it from school because I had to read it for tests and everything. I passed, thankfully, because what I read sometimes I don't understand, but depending on the actual reading itself. I'm going to be doing chapter 1 tonight, which is called and what's crazy is that this book was being read already and they were almost done because the little card or whatever it is, it's a card. They have a card with llamas and houses, and it's really kind of cute. I want to keep the card. Nothing written in it, but I think it was just a bookmark. But the first chapter of it is like, it says Mrs. Rachel Lynde is surprised. Now, if you don't know this story, then this is a good story to actually read, because this is one of the, it says it's filled with mischief, romance, and friendship. This classic book is sure to delight readers of all ages. Like, the first time I read it in elementary school in 5th grade or 4th grade. I can't remember. And then again in middle school. It was a very popular book then. But it is by L.M. Montgomery. And it was given to me by one of the nurses or doctors, and I very much appreciate it to the highest or the fullest, because I needed something to do because I didn't have my phone or anything. So yeah. But it was the edition that I'm about to read from, or this book that I'm about to read it from. It was published in 2020. So 2020. Which was 3 years ago from this year. Lord have mercy. But I do appreciate you guys coming in and listening in a little bit, kind of, because this is a good book to read and listen to, and it's it's a it's a good book. But it's basically was written to the memory of the mother and father of Mr. or Mrs. Montgomery. Don't remember if it was a he or she. There is a prince involved. Yay. Kind of cool. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Let me reply to this message real quick before I forget and don't remember, because it's cool. Okay, so there we go. Sorry about that. Yeah. The chapter is a little long, but it's really not that long if you really think about it too. It is to the memory of the mother and father. For Mr. or Mrs. Montgomery, don't know if it was he or she, can't remember. It was published in 2020. Well, this book itself was. So, but yeah. So, thank you for joining in with Storytime with Izzii. That's me. I am going to be reading Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 1, Mrs. Rachel Lynde is Surprised. And it was written by L.M. Montgomery. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea, sorry, excuse me, Avonlea. Hey, Noble Ron, good morning. Can't remember how to say that word. Good
Well, hello
morning.
there.
How are you?
I'm doing great. Good morning. And yes, now that thing is off, so I can hear you perfectly. Well,
Oh, it was blocking my talk.
I'm sorry.
Like when I was talking, it was just
No,
blocking the talking.
I could hear you, but it was going on at the same time. That's why when I could at the end when I thanked everybody, I could turn it down, and so
Ah.
it was So I couldn't hear anything. I could hear it a little bit, but that was it. And I don't know where to go. Like when that happens, it's weird. It's like it's like because what happened was Cece hit her, but what it was it was her show tonight or last night, and so that was going on, but it's like somehow it gets played again if I open a certain, I don't really know, but and now I'm getting tired explaining it because it's just but it was like just mind numbing. It was like so annoying because I just want to be able to hear what you're saying.
I feel.
But
I feel.
mhm. And what I wanted to say was hello and
Hello.
hello and Anna Green Gables.
Yes. Yes.
This, yeah, when I was a kid on Disney Channel, they
Yeah.
had they had Anna Green, but they also came out with this show called Avonlea that was, I think, based on that
That's how you
somehow.
say that. Okay.
Avon, yeah, that's how they pronounced it, Avonlea, or maybe it could be something else. I never watched it. I never watched one episode. Um, but someone
I
who
watched
likes
it when
this,
I was young.
right?
When I was younger too. When they had
So
it on. Down Disney
yeah,
ain't shit. Excuse me. Disney's
there's a
not. Is not as good as it was.
no, no, it's not. Thank you very much. It
So
is not. When I was a kid, it was a pay channel
you
and
a what?
a pay channel.
You had to pay for the channel?
Yeah, when I was little,
Oh,
absolutely.
okay.
Hmm.
Cool, cool. Go ahead
And
though.
so it would have like adult programming too. Like they used to have a show called So and So Going Home, meaning like James Taylor or Ringo Starr.
Mm.
I couldn't enjoy it then. I would have though if I was an adult
I
then.
don't remember that.
Oh yeah, but I just wanted to say I'm sure you're going to do a great job, and and looking forward to hearing about Anne of Green Gables. Is a very interesting. What can you just say the premise of it?
The say it one more time.
Like just like just like the premise of it. What is this? A little bit of like a
Oh,
trailer.
okay. So basically, Anne of Green Gables. It says I'm gonna read what it says on the back, like the back cover.
Perfect. Perfect.
I'm guessing that's what the premise is.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm
A
still.
summary, basically.
My words aren't going well in my head yet. It says when Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert decide to adopt a boy from an orphanage, they are not sure what to expect. They are in for a surprise when an adventurous, imaginative, red-haired little girl arrives at Green Gables instead. Follow Anne's adventures on Prince Edward Island. Oh, it's an island. Not
Yeah.
okay. So there's no prince, y'all. Sorry, I totally just said something wrong. Follow Anne's adventures on Prince Edward Island in the first of Lucy Maud Montgomery. Okay, so it's a Mrs. It's a Mrs. Lucy Maud Montgomery's much loved stories, filled with mischief, romance, and friendship. This classic book is sure to delight the readers of all ages.
There you go.
Oh my
And you
god,
read
I'm
so well,
excited.
and I love.
I do not
Yeah.
remember this story very well, so I'm
Hmm.
excited at the same time.
Awesome. Awesome.
So how do you say that word, that A word again?
Avonlea is what I think. I'm pretty sure it's what it's called. Avonlea.
Okay. Yeah, because that's one of the first words in here that on the chapter.
Awesome. Awesome.
I was trying to figure out how to say it. I was like, but Avonlea.
Yeah, I would probably say like Avonlea, but from what I remember, Disney Channel they would always say Avonlea. So I
Okay.
remember watching. Yeah.
I know that
Hmm.
they made a show called it's like a bunch of superheroes though, or weird kids or something. I can't remember what it's called.
Oh.
It's on now, like it's on these days, but I don't
Hmm.
remember what it was called.
Right.
But man, Disney does nothing nowadays, and PBS
Yeah.
Kids, they're just like not showing the good stuff anymore.
Exactly.
I
And it's kind
just
of
watch
sad.
I watch
Yeah.
everything on Tubi through this, like I
Oh,
said.
Tubi's a good app for those old
Yes,
like
for the old
Nickelodeon
shit.
stuff.
I'm sorry,
Hmm.
excuse me, for the old things.
Yes. For the things that were good when we knew they were good, and that was
Yeah,
awesome
I'm
times.
still on Degrassi. I've been watching Degrassi.
With Drake. Drake and who else was on there? Is that just Drake? That was a famous person?
Drake, uh,
Grande? Ariana?
no, she wasn't
Okay.
on there.
Gotcha.
There
Just
was a
them.
lot of
Okay.
other people on there, but I just can't remember. I don't remember them. I don't know them now because I haven't
Mm.
really seen them now, except for one. And I saw him on a Hallmark movie, and he was pretty hot then, and he was pretty hot in the show. So I'm like, I don't know what's going on here.
I think they only hire good looking actors on those Hallmark movies.
Don't they? Don't they? I am so that
Yes. It's kind
upsets
of
me a little
yeah.
bit.
Yeah, I
God
know it's
dang,
crazy.
that would hurt. Oh God, they
Yeah.
really do though. Like I don't know if you remember Sav on
No.
Degrassi.
What was
The
that?
he was part of like he was the he was in the Indian the only Indian family they had on there really on Degrassi. It was
Oh
in the later
really?
generation. I don't know if you've watched the later generation.
No, I haven't. But you mean like Indian as in like Middle Eastern descent?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
like it's kind of like you know how he has the arranged marriage and everything like that with his family, and he's like the teenager there, but man, he was hot. Oh God! And then I saw him one time on a Hallmark movie, and he was still he was hotter. I was like, what the hell did you come?
Right.
I don't see anybody anymore. I've seen Drake with his music, but that's about it. I
Yeah.
watched that episode again, and I cried. I cried.
Oh boy. Oh boy.
But I'm happy he didn't die. But it was just the whole point that he got hurt, and then but the person who brought the what's his name, Rick, who brought the
Hmm.
gun to the school or whatnot on that show, he died though, of course, because somebody tried to get the gun from him and shot him instead of whatever. I don't know.
Oh boy.
But he was an abusive person, so he was meant to go. Sorry, no,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna say that.
Well, let
Uh,
me let you get to it to this awesome reading of this awesome book.
oh, thanks.
You're welcome.
I was on my first line, and then I saw you on there, and I was like, okay, maybe he knows a word, and then you said it without me asking, so thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
I appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely.
Avonlea.
Avonlea.
Okay,
Avonlea.
we're just
Hmm.
gonna say it like that because if that's how you heard it, and that's how it's said.
That's it. No, I'm certain now because when they would show like a little commercial for it, it would always the narrator would be like Avonlea, so I know it's that for sure.
Cool bananas. Cool
Awesome.
bananas. I'm excited.
Yes. Have a good read, okay?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye. He helped me so much on this one word that I couldn't figure out. Thank you, Mr. Noble Ron. But let me refresh real quick. Excuse me. Okay. So again, sorry. Resetting. Thank you for coming in to Storytime with Izzii. That's me. This is Anne of Green Gables, the first chapter, and it was by Lucy Maud Montgomery. So it was a Mrs. So this was in memory of her mother and father that she wrote this book or this story herself when she did. The book that I'm about to read from it was published in 2020. So this is a I guess revised edition, or it just came. I guess they just wanted to print it out again. But this is going to be chapter 1. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is surprised. Who's Rachel Lynde? I don't even know. It doesn't say anything about Miss Rachel Lynde in the premise. The summary in the back. But yes. Says Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a little hollow fringed with alders and ladies' eardrops and traversed by a brook that had its source away back in the woods of old Cuthbert Place. It was reputed to be an intricate, headlong brook in its earlier course through those woods, with dark secrets of pool and cascade. But by the time it reached Lynn's Hollow, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream, for even not a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum. It probably was conscious that Mrs. Rachel was sitting at her window, keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed, from brooks and up, and that if she had noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof. There are plenty of people in Avonlea and out of it who can attend closely to their neighbor's business by dint of neglecting their own. But Mrs. Rachel Lynde was one of those capable creatures who can manage their own concerns and those of other folks into the bargain. Excuse me. She was a notable housewife. Her work was always done and well done. She ran the sewing circle, helped run the Sunday school, and was the strongest prop of the Church Aid Society and Foreign Missions Auxiliary. Yet, with all this, Mrs. Rachel found abundant time to sit for hours at her kitchen window, knitting cotton warp quilts. She had knitted 16 of them, as Avonlea housekeepers were wont to tell in odd voices, and keeping a sharp eye on the main road that crossed the hollow and wound up the steep red hill beyond. Since Avonlea occupied a little triangular peninsula jutting out into the Gulf of St. Lawrence with water on two sides of it, anybody who went out of it or into it had to pass over that hill road, and so run the unseen gauntlet of Mrs. Rachel's all-seeing eye. She was sitting there one afternoon in early June. The sun was coming in at the window warm and bright. The orchard on the slope below the house was in a bridal flush of pinky white bloom, hummed over by a myriad of bees. Excuse me. Thomas Lynde, a meek little man whom Avonlea people called Rachel Lynde's husband, was sowing his late turnip seed on the hill field beyond the barn, and Matthew Cuthbert ought to have been sowing his on the big red brook field away over by Green Gables. Mrs. Rachel knew that he ought because she had heard him tell Peter Morrison the evening before in William J. Blair's store over at Carmody that he meant to sow his turnip seed the next afternoon. Peter had asked him, of course, for Matthew Cuthbert had never been known to volunteer information about anything in his whole life. And yet here was Matthew Cuthbert at 3:30 on the afternoon of a busy day, placidly driving over the hollow and up the hill. Moreover, he wore a white collar and his best suit of clothes, which was plain proof that he was going out of Avonlea. And he had the buggy and the sorrel mare, which betokened that he was going a considerable distance. Now, where was Matthew Cuthbert going, and why was he going there? Interesting. Don't know. Don't remember. Had it been any other man in Avonlea, Mrs. Rachel, deftly putting this and that together, might have given a pretty good guess as to both questions. But Matthew so rarely went out from home that it must be something pressing and unusual which was taking him. He was the shyest man alive and hated to have to go among strangers or to any place which he might have to talk, or where he might have to talk. Excuse me. Matthew, dressed up with a white collar and driving in a buggy, was something that didn't happen often. Mrs. Rachel, ponder as she might, could make nothing of it, and her afternoon's enjoyment was spoiled. I'll just step over to Green Gables after tea and find out from Marilla where he's gone and why, the worthy woman finally concluded. He doesn't generally go to town this time of year, and he never visits. If he'd run out of turnip seed, he wouldn't dress up and take the buggy to go for more. He wasn't driving fast enough to be going for a doctor. Yet something must have happened since last night to start him off. I'm clean puzzled, that's what, and I won't know a minute's peace of mind or conscience until I know what has taken Matthew Cuthbert out of Avonlea today. Accordingly, after tea, Mrs. Rachel set out. She had not far to go. The big, rambling, orchard embowered house where the Cuthberts lived was a scant quarter of a mile up the road from Lynn's Hollow. To be sure, the long lane made it a good deal further. Matthew Cuthbert's father, as shy and silent as his son after him, had got as far away as he possibly could from his fellow men without actually retreating into the woods when he founded his homestead. Green Gables was built at the furthest edge of his cleared land, and there it was to this day, barely visible from the main road, along which all the other Avonlea houses were so sociably situated. Mrs. Rachel Lynde did not call living in such a place living at all. It's just staying, that's what, she said as she stepped along the deep, rutted, grassy lane bordered with wild rose bushes. It's no wonder Matthew and Marilla are both a little odd, living way back here by themselves. Trees aren't much company, though, dear knows, if they were, there'd be enough of them. I'd rather look at people. To be sure, they seem contented enough, but then, I suppose, they're used to it. A body can get used to anything, even to being hanged, as the Irishman said. Dang, okay. Excuse me. With this, Mrs. Rachel stepped out of the lane into the backyard of Green Gables. Very green and neat and precise was that yard, set about on one side with great patriarchal willows, and on the other with prim Lombardies. Not a stray stick nor stone was to be seen, for Mrs. Rachel would have seen it if there had been. Privately, she was of the opinion that Marilla Cuthbert swept that yard as often as she swept her house. One could have eaten a meal off the ground without overbrimming the proverbial peck of dirt. Mrs. Rachel rapped smartly at the kitchen door and stepped in. Excuse me, gotta turn the page. Stepped in when bidden to do so. The kitchen at Green Gables was a cheerful apartment, or would have been cheerful if it had not been so painfully clean as to give it something of the appearance of an unused parlor. Its windows looked east and west. Through the west one, looking out on the backyard, came a flood of mellow June sunlight. But the east one, whence you got a glimpse of the bloom white cherry trees in the left orchard and nodding, slender birches down in the hollow by the brook, was greened over by a tangle of vines. Here sat Marilla Cuthbert, when she sat at all, always slightly distrustful of sunshine, which seemed to her too dancing and irresponsible a thing for a world which was meant to be taken seriously. And here she sat now, knitting, and the table behind her was laid for supper. Mrs. Rachel, before she had fairly closed the door, had taken a mental note of everything that was on that table. There were 3 plates laid, so that Marilla so that Marilla must be expecting someone home with Matthew to tea. But the dishes were everyday dishes, and there was only crab apple preserves and one kind of cake, so that the expected company could not be any particular company. Yet, what of Matthew's white collar and the sorrel mare? Mrs. Rachel was getting fairly dizzy with this unusual mystery about quiet, unmysterious Green Gables. Good evening, Rachel, Marilla said briskly. This is a real fine evening, isn't it? Won't you sit down? How are all your folks? Something that, for lack of any other name, might be called friendship existed, and always had existed between Marilla Cuthbert and Mrs. Rachel, in spite of, or perhaps because of, their dissimilarity. Marilla was a tall, thin woman with angles and without curves. Her dark hair showed some gray streaks and was always twisted up in a hard little knot, behind with 2 wire hairpins stuck aggressively through it. She looked like a woman of narrow experience and rigid conscience, which she was, but there was a saving something about her mouth which, if it had been ever so slightly developed, might have been considered indicative of a sense of humor. We're all pretty well, said Miss Rachel. I was kind of afraid you weren't, though, when I saw Matthew starting off today. I thought maybe he was going to the doctor's. Marilla's lips twitched understandingly. She had expected Mrs. Rachel up. She had known that the sight of Matthew jaunting off so unaccountably would be too much for her neighbor's curiosity. Oh no, I'm quite well, although I had a bad headache yesterday, she said. Matthew went to Bright River. We're getting a little boy from an orphan asylum in Nova Scotia, and he's coming on the train tonight. If Marilla had said that Matthew had gone to Bright River to meet a kangaroo from Australia, meet a kangaroo from Australia, Mrs. Rachel could not have been more astonished. She was actually stricken dumb for 5 seconds. It was unsupposable that Marilla was making fun of her, but Mrs. Rachel had always almost forced to suppose it. Are you in earnest, Marilla? She demanded when voice returned to her. Yes, of course, said Marilla, as if getting boys from orphan asylums in Nova Scotia were part of the usual spring work of any well-regulated Avonlea farm instead of being an unheard-of innovation. Mrs. Rachel felt that she had received a severe mental jolt. She thought in exclamation points. A boy! Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert, of all people, adopting a boy from an orphan asylum. Well, the world was certainly turning upside down. She would be surprised at nothing after this. Nothing. What on earth put such a notion into your head? She demanded disapprovingly. This had been done without her advice being asked and must perforce be disapproved. Well, we've been thinking about it for some time, all winter in fact, returned Marilla. Mrs. Alexander Spencer was up here one day before Christmas, and she said she was going to get a little girl from the asylum over in Hopetown in the spring. Her cousin lives there, and Mrs. Spencer has visited her and knows all about it. So Matthew and I have talked it over off and on ever since. We thought we'd get a boy. Matthew is getting up in years. You know, he's 60, and he isn't so spry as he once was. His heart troubles him a good deal. And you know how desperate hard it's got to be to get hired help. There's never anybody to be had but those stupid half-grown little French boys. And as soon as you do get one, And as soon as you do get one, broke into your ways and taught something, he's up and off to the lobster canneries or to the States. At first, Matthew suggested getting a Barnardo boy, but I said no, flat to that. They may be all right. I'm not saying they're not, but no London street Arabs for me, I said. Give me a native born at least. There'll be a risk no matter who we get. But I'll feel easier in my mind and sleep sounder at nights if we get a born Canadian. So in the end, we decided to ask Mrs. Spencer to pick us one out that when she went over to get her little girl. We heard last week she was going, so we sent her word by Richard Spencer's folks at Carmody to bring us a smart, likely boy of about 10 or 11. We decided that would be the best age. Old enough to be of some use in doing chores right off, and young enough to be trained up proper. We mean to give him a good home and schooling. We had a telegram from Mrs. Alexander Spencer today. The mailman brought it from the station, saying they were coming on the 5:30 train tonight, so Matthew went to the Bright River to meet him. Mrs. Spencer will drop him off there. Of course, she goes on to White Sands Station herself. Mrs. Rachel prided herself on always speaking her mind. She proceeded to speak it now, having adjusted her mental attitude to this amazing piece of news. Well, Marilla, I'll just tell you plain that I think you're doing a mighty foolish thing, a risky thing. That's what. You don't know what you're getting. You're bringing a strange child into your house and home, and you don't know a single thing about him, nor what his disposition is like, nor what sort of parents he had, nor how he's likely to turn out. Why, it was only last week I read in the paper how a man and his wife up west of the island took a boy out of an orphan asylum, and he set fire to the house at night. Set it on purpose, Marilla, and nearly burnt them into a crisp in their beds. And I know another case where an adopted boy used to suck the eggs. They couldn't break him off of it. If you had asked my advice in the matter, which you didn't do, Marilla, I'd have said for mercy's sake not to think of such a thing, that's what. This job's comforting seemed neither to offend nor to alarm Marilla. She knitted steadily on. I don't deny there's something in what you say, Rachel. I've had some qualms myself, but Matthew was terrible set on it. I could see it, so I gave in. It's so seldom Matthew sets his mind on anything that when he does, I always feel it's my duty to give in. And as for the risk, there's risks in pretty near everything a body does in this world. There's risks in people's having children of their own if it comes to that. They don't always turn out well, and then Nova Scotia is right close to the island. It isn't as if we were getting him from England or the States. He can't be much different from ourselves. Well, I hope it will turn out all right, said Mrs. Rachel in a tone that plainly indicated her painful doubts. Only don't say I didn't warn you if he burns Green Gables down or puts strychnine something in the well. I heard of a case over in New Brunswick where an orphan asylum child did that, and the whole family died in fearful agonies. Only it was a girl in this instance. Well, we're not getting a girl, said Marilla, as if poisoning wells were a purely feminine accomplishment and not to be dreaded in the case of a boy. I'd never dream of taking a girl to bring up. I wonder at Mrs. Alexander Spencer for doing it. But there she wouldn't shrink from adopting a whole orphan asylum if she took it into her head. Mrs. Rachel would have liked to stay until Matthew came home with his imported orphan, but reflecting that it would be a good 2 hours at least before his arrival, she concluded to go up the road to Robert Bell's and tell them the news. It would certainly make a sensation second to none, and Mrs. Rachel dearly loved to make a sensation. So she took herself away, somewhat to Marilla's relief, for the latter felt her doubts and fears reviving under the influence of Mrs. Rachel's pessimism. Well, of all things that ever were or will be, ejaculated Mrs. Rachel when she was safely out in the lane. It does really seem as if I must be dreaming. Well, I'm sorry for that poor young one, and no mistake. Matthew and Marilla, don't know anything about children, and they'll expect him to be wiser and steadier than that his own grandfather, if so be's he ever had a grandfather, which is doubtful. It seems uncanny to think of a child at Green Gables somehow. There's never been one there, for Matthew and Marilla were grown up when the the new house was built. If they ever were children, which is hard to believe when one looks at them, I wouldn't be in that orphan's shoes for anything. But I pity him, that's what. So said Mrs. Rachel to the wild rose bushes out of the fullness of her heart. But if she could have seen the child who was waiting patiently at the Bright River station at that very moment, her pity would have been still deeper and more profound. That is the end of chapter 1. So tomorrow will be chapter 2, which is Matthew Cuthbert is surprised. So first one was Rachel Lynde is surprised. Now it's going to be Matthew who's being surprised. So I can't wait to see what happens, because I totally do not remember the story. And even rereading it right now, I still don't remember it. So hopefully it'll come back. But I do appreciate you guys coming in and listening. I will say that I am happy to be doing the story times again with you guys. I don't want to be here right now, but I am going to push through and still do this, because I've missed doing this with you guys. So thank you to Michael J, Mr. Amazing, Cecilia Grace, Chocolate Yoda, Davey Astrophysics, Matthew Burris, Carletta Carey, Peggy Joe, Brian Coletto, Sharon, Daryl with the dashes, Levi, Noble Ron, and thank you, Noble Ron, for coming up. And we have to figure out when the last time I was on yours. Still, I don't remember. Robert Prash, Dr. Robert James Goodman, Royo Reese, Ellen Sutter, Adam Coates, Marcella. It's always hard for me to remember which way it goes. I'm so sorry. Much love to you. I'm so sorry if I butchered it. Tonil M. Jackson, Christopher John Martins, Siobhan, the relationship strategist, Mojo, Miranda May, and Kathleen White. You guys have been awesome, and I truly, truly appreciate you coming in and listening in to the reading. So until next time, that was Storytime with Izzii, reading chapter 1 of Anne of Green Gables, and it was by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Until tomorrow or later, I'm not sure. I might do this again later if I can't sleep. I love you guys. Much love, respect, blessings to you. Hugs, kisses, and I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.
Yay!